Ever imagine a murder case that shook up maps and rewrote history? Get ready to dive into one because we are. We're unpacking McGirt v. Oklahoma, a case that went from a tragic crime all the way to a landmark Supreme Court decision about tribal sovereignty. And believe me, the twists and turns are way more intense than any legal drama you've seen. Okay, so we've got a ton of fascinating stuff to dig into for you today. News articles, legal analyses, even first-hand accounts. They all come together to paint a picture of how this case makes us rethink some pretty fundamental stuff. Land ownership, jurisdiction, and what justice really means when it comes to tribal nations inside the United States.
Yeah, and what's really interesting here, it's how this seemingly isolated event, this one crime, unearthed centuries of really complex history. It raised these massive questions about, who actually has the authority to prosecute crimes, and challenged all these deeply ingrained assumptions we have about land ownership in this country.
Okay, so let's rewind the clock. It's 1999 back in Oklahoma. A man named George Jacobs is murdered. The man convicted. Patrick Murphy. Seems like, an open and shut case.
You'd think so, right? But during Murphy's appeals process, his lawyers, they did something unexpected. They argued that Oklahoma never actually had the right to prosecute him in the first place. Their reasoning. The crime happened on land that was part of the Muscogee Nation reservation.
Wait, hold on. How can a state not have jurisdiction over a crime that happened within its borders? I mean, that just doesn't seem possible.
That's where the unique legal standing of Native American tribes comes in. They have this special status sovereign nations within the U.S. That means they've got their own governments, their own laws, their own courts. It's like nations within a nation.
So they're kind of like their own separate entity.
Exactly. And a big part of that sovereignty is that states can't just prosecute crimes that happen on tribal land. That's usually the responsibility of tribal courts or the federal government.
Okay, so was Oklahoma just completely unaware that this murder happened on what might have been tribal land?
Well, Oklahoma came back with a very bold claim. They argued that the reservation, the one in question, it didn't actually exist legally anymore. Gone. They said that over a century, all these legal complexities and government actions, they dissolved it.
Wow.
Murphy's case basically directly challenged that. It put this whole land dispute right in the spotlight.
So now it's not even about the murder so much anymore.
Not really.
Wow. So this murder case becomes this huge legal battle over if a reservation even exists. How does it go from, a local courtroom all the way up to the Supreme Court?
Well, Murphy's argument about the reservation threw a wrench into everything. His case slowly but steadily, it moved up through the courts, and finally it landed in the Supreme Court in 2018.
Did they make a decision?
Well, not quite. They actually delayed their decision.
What?
Yeah, they sent the case back to a lower court without even really dealing with the main question. Did the reservation still exist?
Talk about a cliffhanger. Why didn't they just decide?
It's thought that Justice Gorsuch, who often sides with tribes, he had to step away from the case. He'd worked on it before, earlier in his career. That probably caused a tie, or at least made a decision impossible. But this delay, it wouldn't last forever. Another case, very similar, was making its way through the system, the case of McGirt.
Okay, so let's talk about this McGirt. Who was he, and how does his case get mixed up in all of this?
McGirt was Seminole Nation, convicted in Oklahoma of sex crimes. Just like with Murphy, his lawyers saw a chance, an opening, with all this uncertainty about where the Muscogee Reservation's boundaries were.
Because of what happened with the Murphy case.
Yeah, exactly. They said that since the crime was on what used to be tribal territory, Oklahoma had no business prosecuting him.
Okay, so we've got two separate cases, both headed for this huge question. Tribal land and state power. What happens next?
The Supreme Court, all the justices there this time, they agreed to hear McGirt's case, McGirt v. Oklahoma. And in 2020, they made a decision that changed everything.
They sided with McGirt, didn't they?
They did. The court said that Congress, they never officially dissolved the Muscogee Reservation. This meant a massive part of Oklahoma, land the state thought was theirs, was still tribal land.
Wow. Talk about a legal earthquake. Wow, that's huge. So what did this mean for McGirt, for Murphy, and for everyone else in Oklahoma who suddenly had their cases in question?
It was a big deal right away. Oklahoma had to admit that they'd been prosecuting especially crimes involving tribal citizens on land they didn't have jurisdiction over. But the federal government still had a role. They were now the main ones responsible for prosecuting serious crimes in this massive area that was back to being tribal land.
It's easy to get lost in the legal stuff, but this was about real people. What happened to Murphy and McGirt after McGirt?
Okay, so Murphy's original conviction, yeah, that was overturned. But here's the thing, he wasn't let off. They retried him in federal court, found him guilty again, and this time sentenced him to life. McGirt, though, totally different story. He got a plea deal with federal prosecutors, and after they factored in the time he'd already served, he was released.
Wow, what a difference. You'd think Oklahoma prisons would be emptying out with a ruling like this.
Everyone thought so. People in Oklahoma were saying thousands of prisoners might be able to get new trials. It didn't quite happen like that. Only 68 people were actually released because of McGirt.
Really? That few. Why didn't those predictions come true?
Overturning a conviction, even with jurisdiction problems, it's incredibly hard. Lots of cases just got moved to federal or tribal courts to be looked at again.
I bet this whole situation put tribal leaders in a difficult spot. These horrible crimes at the center of it all, but also this big win for them. How did they react to all of this?
Really complex, right? I actually talked to Chief James Floyd. He was head of the Muscogee Nation when the Murphy case was at the Supreme Court. He knew people affected by what both Murphy and McGirt did. Those crimes really weighed on him, but he understood why the lawyers used the strategy. It shows the tough position tribes are often in, fighting for their rights sometimes. Victories come from awful situations.
It reminds you that these cases aren't just legal arguments, it's people's lives. McGirt didn't stop with the Muscogee Nation, did it? Other tribes in Oklahoma were affected too.
Yeah, the Supreme Court's reasoning in McGirt, it had bigger consequences. See, the history, the treaties, the laws they looked at were very similar for other Oklahoma tribes, the Cherokee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw Nations.
So after McGirt, I'm guessing those tribes saw their chance.
Oh, absolutely. People from those tribes started using the same arguments, saying Oklahoma couldn't prosecute them for crimes on what was historically their land. And you know what? They were right. The Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals, following the Supreme Court, agreed that McGirt applied to them too. Their reservations still existed.
Now we're talking about a much larger area, not just Muscogee land anymore. Give us a sense of the scale. Just how much land are we talking about?
Massive. Huge. McGirt, when you apply it to all 5 tribes, it returns 19 million acres of land to tribal control. That's like half of Oklahoma, bigger than 9 states put together.
Wow. That is hard to even imagine. The largest restoration of tribal land ever, a total redrawing of the map.
Exactly. Never happened before. And this massive shift, well, it came with some pretty big, very real challenges.
19 million acres suddenly run by tribes. That must have been a lot for the justice systems to handle. What happened right away?
Oh, it was a huge adjustment. But remember, these tribes, they already had their own courts, laws, law enforcement, even before McGirt. They were working. What changed was how many cases they suddenly had.
So instead of a few crimes, tribal courts now had thousands.
Exactly. Think about it. They had to update their laws almost overnight to deal with all these new types of cases. Plus, they needed more judges, lawyers, staff, everything. And on top of all that, they had to figure out how to handle way more people in prison. They even had to make deals with county jails and state prisons.
Sounds like total chaos, but also a chance to rethink justice, to do things differently. Did McGirt change sentencing or how justice works there?
That's a really important point. McGirt wasn't just about land. It was about tribes actually getting to use their sovereignty. They could now decide what justice looks like for them, which was often very different from what the state was doing.
That's really interesting. Any examples of how that worked in real life?
Yeah, the Choctaw Nation is a great example. I talked to Cara Bacon, a tribal prosecutor there. She said working in the state system made her see how limited it was, always focused on punishment instead of helping people change.
Sounds like she had a different idea for the Choctaw Nation.
Absolutely. Her and many others in the tribe, they believe in looking at the whole person. So instead of just giving the harshest sentence, they focus on rehabilitation, having people give back to the community, and getting to the root of what causes crime.
So we've gone from one murder case to a nationwide debate about tribal sovereignty, this huge land shift, and now a totally different way of thinking about justice.
Amazing. And it doesn't stop there. McGirt is still having effects, legal, political, cultural. It reminds us that the past never really stays in the past, and the fight for Native American rights isn't over.
You've shown us just how much this decision changed things for Oklahoma and tribal nations, but for someone who doesn't know much about this, it can be hard to really get it.
You're right. This isn't just a case in a textbook. It's about real communities, real people, and the fight for self-determination.
Exactly. So for our listeners who might be thinking, okay, but what does this mean for me? What's the key takeaway from McGirt?
For me, it's recognizing that treaties are the most important law we have. The U.S. was built on agreements with Native American tribes. agreements that were broken or ignored for so long. McGirt is a step towards finally honoring those agreements and recognizing that tribes are sovereign.
It also shows how these legal battles over tribal rights aren't just abstract. They affect everyone, native and non-native. It's not history. It's the here and now.
Exactly. McGirt forced Oklahoma, even the whole country, to face some uncomfortable truths about its past, about how indigenous people were treated. This conversation isn't over, and it's a big deal for how we handle crime, land rights, and the entire relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government.
It really does seem like the McGirt ruling was like this huge turning point, Not just a win in court, but something that sparked all these bigger conversations about justice and sovereignty and what the future holds for tribes. What kind of lasting impact do you think this will have?
Oh, there's no doubt. McGirt has been huge for tribal leaders, for activists. It's given them this really strong legal precedent, something they can point to as they're fighting for treaty rights and trying to reclaim their place.
So even though the case was in Oklahoma, its reach goes way beyond that.
100%. The core issues here, treaty rights, tribal sovereignty, limits on state power, they matter everywhere. We're already seeing similar legal fights popping up in other states with big native populations. This is far from over.
It feels like a real turning point, a shift in how tribes, states, and the federal government relate to each other.
You're right on the money there. McGirt is a powerful reminder. The U.S. was built on treaties with sovereign native nations. Those treaties, they were ignored, violated for centuries. But now, the highest court in the land is saying they have to be taken seriously. That's a big deal.
We've covered a ton of ground. A murder case, this major Supreme Court decision, legal back and forth, and the human side of it all. As we wrap up, what's the one question you want to leave our listeners with? What's that thought that'll really stick with them?
Okay, here's something to chew on. If treaties are the supreme law, just like the court said, what other past injustices need to be addressed? Could this case inspire people to fight for a future where everyone's sovereignty and rights are respected, truly upheld?
Those are some powerful questions, ones we all need to be thinking about carefully. Exploring McGirt v. Oklahoma has been quite the journey. This case, it reminds us that the law changes. History isn't set in stone, and the struggle for justice, for sovereignty, never really ends.